What if a single word changed the entire meaning of the most important ancient story ever written? In one of the oldest translations of the Bible, a critical Hebrew term in Genesis 6 was replaced, and that change may have reshaped how millions understood the flood for over 400 years. But what if that wasn't just a translation choice? What if it was a decision that removed something far more disturbing from the original text? Because once you see what was changed in Genesis 6-4, the entire story begins to look completely different. Genesis 6-4 stands as one of the most heavily reshaped passages in the English biblical tradition, where 4 key expressions were adjusted in translation, subtly but powerfully altering its meaning. When the Hebrew text is read in its original form, the passage shifts away from a broad moral warning and begins to resemble a precise and structured account of something far more complex in ancient history. The transformation starts with the most familiar substitution, the word giants, in the King James tradition. Yet the Hebrew text never uses that term. Instead, it preserves the word Nephilim, a term rooted in naphal, meaning to fall or to cause others to fall. This is not a description of physical height, but of identity and function, those associated with a fall or bringing others into it. Because once the original meaning is restored, the entire structure of Genesis 6 begins to shift in unexpected ways. The contrast is not minor. Giants evokes folklore and physical strength, but Nephilim points to a deeper conceptual category entirely removed from simple human description. In Genesis 6-4, the term appears alongside a narrative describing a world increasingly destabilized, where boundaries between realms are portrayed as crossed in ways that reshape humanity's condition. This is where the tension in translation becomes unavoidable. The King James translators, working in 1611, had access to multiple textual traditions, including rabbinic commentary and the Greek Septuagint. The distinction between Nephilim and giants was not hidden from them, it was understood. Yet the choice they made shifted the interpretive frame towards something more familiar and less conceptually disruptive. As a result, what could have been read as a precise ancient designation became a generalized figure of mythic strength. The sharper implications of the Hebrew root were softened, and with that shift, the passage moved from specificity into abstraction. And this is only the first layer of deeper alterations embedded in Genesis 6-4. They chose the word giants because it fits a familiar mythic image, stories of ancient warriors, towering figures, and legendary enemies on the battlefield. It feels recognizable, almost safe, but it completely removes the deeper meaning hidden in the original Hebrew text. In the Hebrew, the word is Nephilim, not giants. And that change is not cosmetic, it is structural, because giants describe size, while Nephilim comes from naphal, meaning to fall, or to cause others to fall. It is not about physical stature, but about a condition tied to collapse, disruption, and a downward influence over humanity. That means the text is not simply describing strong or unusual men. It is pointing to something far more unsettling in concept beings associated with humanity's falling away from its intended state. That meaning is precise in Hebrew, but it disappears the moment the word is replaced. And this is the point where the shift becomes critical. Giants turns the passage into folklore. Nephilim points to something far more difficult to reduce or simplify. One version becomes a story of ancient heroes. The other carries the weight of a deeper, more disturbing interpretation. For over 400 years, readers have encountered Genesis 6-4 through that softened lens, unaware that the original term carries an entirely different layer of meaning beneath it. The second alteration sits deeper in the text, just a few words, left without clarification, yet carrying a tension that is impossible to ignore. It states that the Nephilim were present on the earth before the flood, and then adds something even more striking. And also after it. Pause on that. Because the flood in Genesis is not described as partial, it is presented as a total reset, a complete removal of life as it was known. Genesis 6-7 declares that God decided to destroy mankind, along with beasts, creeping things, and the birds of the air. The language is absolute, sweeping, final in scope. Yet Genesis 6-4, in the same narrative flow, introduces a clause that appears to sit in direct tension with that total destruction. If everything was removed, how does anything persist? The text simply states that the Nephilim existed before the flood and also after. No explanation, no transition, no resolution offered within the standard reading tradition. The implication sits there, unresolved, creating a fracture in the surface narrative. Within the later Western canon, this tension is typically read without deeper investigation into its structural implications. But when the passage is read as continuous Hebrew narrative, the contradiction becomes visible. One verse describes total eradication, while another implies continuity. That is the point where interpretation becomes unstable. And it is also where the text begins to suggest that what was preserved in translation may not fully reflect what the original framing intended to convey. The Book of Enoch, especially chapters 6 and 7, expands this narrative with a level of detail absent from the canonical text. It describes how around 200 celestial beings descended to earth, gathering on Mount Hermon, where they bound themselves in a collective oath. This was not portrayed as a temporary act, but a sealed agreement designed so that none could abandon the decision once it was made. From this union with human women, the text states that the Nephilim were born. Their emergence is described as rapid and destabilizing. They grew beyond ordinary limits and began consuming resources at a scale that overwhelmed entire communities. As the account intensifies, so does the collapse of order. Food sources were depleted. The text then describes a progression into extreme violence. First, the consumption of all available provisions, then animals, and eventually, in the most severe passages, the breakdown of boundaries between life forms and survival itself. At its peak, the narrative portrays a world pushed into complete imbalance, where the natural structure of life is no longer sustained. In response to this escalation, the Book of Enoch describes the earth itself as crying out, a symbolic image of total corruption reaching a point of no return, prompting a direct call for divine intervention. The response to the crisis described in the earlier accounts escalates into one of the most dramatic events in Genesis, the flood. In this framing, the archangels present the situation before the heavenly throne, and the response is not gradual, it is absolute, a global reset. Within this interpretation, the flood is not described merely as punishment for moral corruption in abstract terms, but as an intervention triggered by something far more specific, a world structure that had become fundamentally altered. The language suggests a form of containment rather than symbolic judgment, where the scope of destruction is total, yet directed toward restoring order. At the center of this discussion is the phrase, "children of God," used in the English translation of Genesis 6. Behind it lies the Hebrew term Bene Elohim, a phrase that appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible with consistent meaning. In Job 1-6, the Bene Elohim appear before the throne of God as part of a divine council. In Job 38-7, they are present at the creation narrative, rejoicing as the foundations of the world are laid. Across these contexts, the term consistently refers to a celestial assembly rather than human lineage. This consistency is critical because in Genesis 6, the same phrase is translated differently, shifting its interpretive direction. Instead of maintaining the established usage seen in Job, the English rendering allows a human-centered reading to emerge, altering the perceived nature of the passage. The result is a divergence in interpretation where the same Hebrew expression is understood in one context as celestial beings and in another as human descendants. That shift becomes one of the key turning points in how the narrative of Genesis 6 is traditionally understood. This final shift in translation completes a pattern that gradually reshapes the entire reading of Genesis 6. The phrase, "renowned men," appears simple, even heroic, but it carries a very specific interpretive direction. It replaces the Hebrew term Gibborim, a word that does not merely describe fame or strength, but functions within a much broader and more complex context. Historically, one of the key interpretive frameworks that influenced later readings was the Sethite theory, which emerged in the 4th century. It proposed that the sons of God were not celestial beings, but human descendants of Seth. This interpretation does not appear in earlier Jewish or early Christian sources in any developed form, yet it became widely adopted in later theological systems as a way to stabilize the text within a human-only framework. Before this shift, earlier writers such as Flavius Josephus and Philo of Alexandria read the passage differently, often interpreting it as involving non-human or celestial interaction. Early Christian thinkers like Tertullian and Justin Martyr also reflected interpretations closer to that older tradition. In that original linguistic environment, Gibborim sits alongside Nephilim and Bene Elohim, forming a linked conceptual structure. It does not function as a standalone term for heroic figures, but as part of a larger narrative about hybridization and disruption in the ancient world's order. However, in English translation, renowned men reframes the concept into something familiar: heroes, legends, figures of admiration. This softens the category, shifting it away from its more complex Hebrew context and placing it within a culturally recognizable archetype. The result is a reinterpretation that changes tone, scope, and implication. What was once part of a tightly connected Hebrew framework becomes, in translation, a more conventional narrative of ancient greatness, rather than a text embedded in far more contested interpretive traditions. Now the passage is read again, stripped of later interpretive filters, returning to the structure implied by the original Hebrew text. There were Nephilim, described as those associated with falling or causing others to fall, present on the earth before the flood and also after it. The text does not present them as mythic embellishments, but as part of a continuing reality within the narrative frame of Genesis 6. When the Bene Elohim, understood in other Hebrew passages as members of the divine council, are described as joining with the daughters of men, the text presents the birth of a distinct outcome, the Gibborim. Within this reconstructed reading, they are not framed as heroic figures, but as a disruptive and violent generation appearing in the antediluvian world. This structure places all three terms, Nephilim, Bene Elohim, and Gibborim, within a single connected sequence, each layer building on the last. And once this original structure is restored, the text begins to point towards something even older, something preserved outside the standard biblical canon. The result is a passage that reads less like a simple moral statement and more like a tightly interwoven narrative describing a breakdown in boundaries within the ancient world. In this restored reading, Genesis 6-4 becomes a concentrated account of transition and consequence, where language carries specific relational meaning rather than generalized labels. It reflects the structure present in the Hebrew wording before later translation choices shaped how the passage would be received in later centuries. The gap between the Hebrew text and later translations is where the Book of Enoch becomes essential for interpretation. Preserved for centuries within the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, it survives as one of the most extensive ancient works that parallels and expands the narrative elements found in Genesis 6. In 1 Enoch, chapters 6 and 7, the account describes a descent of celestial beings who gather on Mount Hermon and bind themselves in a collective oath. This act is presented as deliberate and irreversible, establishing the foundation for what follows in the narrative. From this union with human women, the text describes the emergence of the Nephilim, portrayed as a generation that rapidly disrupts the balance of the world around them. The narrative intensifies in chapter 8, where knowledge and practices are attributed to these beings as being transmitted into human society, contributing to widespread corruption and destabilization. The text frames this not as isolated events, but as a systemic transformation affecting multiple layers of human civilization. Later sections of the Book of Enoch describe the consequences following the flood in a distinctive way. Rather than presenting a completely closed narrative, It introduces the idea that certain entities persist in an unresolved condition. The spirits associated with the Nephilim are depicted as existing in a constrained state, neither fully integrated into the divine realm nor fully part of the human world. This creates a conceptual framework used to interpret later references to unclean or wandering spirits in related traditions. This interpretive connection becomes especially notable when comparing it to passages in the canonical New Testament. Jude 1:14 is often discussed because it closely echoes wording found in 1 Enoch, particularly regarding divine judgment imagery. Similarly, 2 Peter 2-4 describes angels who sinned and were cast into chains of darkness, language that strongly parallels the structure found in Enochic accounts of the Watcher's punishment. These overlaps have led scholars to examine how different textual traditions interacted during the formation of the biblical canon, and how certain writings remained in circulation within some communities while being excluded from others. The Book of Enoch, in this context, functions as a parallel interpretive lens that preserves an alternative framework for understanding the narrative world surrounding Genesis 6 and its theological extensions. The narrative closes with a conclusion that fundamentally reshapes how the entire framework is understood. The Nephilim are not simply presented as figures of the past, but as entities whose influence is described as extending beyond the flood narrative itself. The surviving tradition suggests that what was removed or softened in later transmission may have been central to how the original text was understood in earlier contexts. Over time, certain passages were preserved in some traditions and omitted in others, creating a divergence in how the story is read. What remains is a layered text, one where meaning depends heavily on which tradition is followed and which sources are included or excluded from the final form of the canon.